The rain began unexpectedly. It wasn't a heavy downpour, nor was it a drizzle. It was the kind of rain Chicago experienced in mid-March, cold, slow, and persistent. It caused everything to hesitate, from the footsteps of passers-by to the thoughts of those busier than time itself. A silver-bearded man, wearing a worn-out coat with frayed fur and shoes with a hole in the right toe, stood silently at the intersection of Madison and Wacker. His hand held a violin, so old that its varnish had almost entirely peeled off, and he began to play the first notes. There was no hat for collecting money, no sign pleading for help, no expression other than absolute concentration. A slow, classical melody, melancholic but not sorrowful, resonated like a call from the city's memories. Each note seemed to pierce through the cold glass layers of skyscrapers, seeking to enter the minds of those who had forgotten they once dreamed. Across the street, a sleek black Mercedes S580 had its rear wheel askew. The wheel had come off the rim as if someone had loosened it in the middle of the night. No one noticed. The traffic light remained red. People continued walking. Only one person paid attention. Jonah Beckett. He didn't approach immediately. He merely stopped playing and tilted his head to look at the wheel. His eyes squinted, the kind of squint belonging to someone experienced in mechanics, engineering, or sound, the kind of person who could detect an error from a slight vibration. He quietly pulled an old screwdriver from his side pocket and crossed the street. No one called out. No one signaled. No one requested it. But he bent down, knelt on one knee, and began tightening the wheel bolts with his bare hands, amid the cold rain. A moment later, the glass doors of the building across the street slid open. A young woman in a black blazer with long hair tied neatly, eyes on her phone, stepped out, only to stop abruptly when she saw Jonah. Lila Blake. She looked at the strange man crouched beside her car. My car? Is something wrong with it?" she asked, voice unsure, half panicked, half wary. Jonah didn't look up. He simply said softly, like wind slipping through, "Someone loosened the bolts. If you'd driven, the wheel would have come off in 30 seconds. Lila held her breath. "How do you know?" This time he looked up. Eyes gray, worn but gleaming, like they'd just been rinsed clean by rain. "I used to design silence, so I'm very good at hearing things no one else hears." If you've ever experienced that moment, when someone who seemed invisible suddenly read the smallest detail of your life, you'll understand why Lila didn't call security. She just stood there, breath held, watching a strange man use a screwdriver like a conductor, leading a reverse symphony. No sound, but full of rhythm, full of structure. And when he finished, instead of asking for anything, he simply placed his hand on the body of his violin. "Would you like to hear the piece I wrote for my wife?" he asked. Lila didn't know whether to nod or shake her head, but he played anyway, and the melody was hauntingly familiar. Inside the building, Ethan Blake stepped out of the elevator. The hallway lighting cast his shadow so long it seemed to walk ahead of him. His eyes never stayed on anyone for more than 3 seconds. His mouth never smiled unless cameras were watching, and every footstep clicked like commands inside a code base. He saw his daughter standing next to a homeless man, playing violin beside her car. His expression wasn't anger, it was cold. The kind of cold that feels like solid steel, the kind that shames you without a word. "Lila, get in the car." "Dad," I said, "get in the car." Lila froze. Jonah kept playing. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. Jonah didn't look up. He simply said, "A man who once had an employee badge." Ethan narrowed his eyes. He meant to say something, but turned away. "Rick," he called to the bodyguard by the entrance, "take care of this." In an instant, Jonah saw it all. A harsh glare, a nod of dismissal, and a hand placed firmly on his shoulder. But he didn't resist. He slipped the violin into a cloth bag, stood up, and walked away. He said nothing more. Lila watched him go. That walk was the walk of someone who had once stood at center stage and now had to exit through the side door. If you've ever been dismissed, not because you were unworthy, but because you no longer fit the scene where power was being played, perhaps you should leave a word under this video. No need to explain, no need to recount it all, just one word. I've been there. You never know how much comfort it might bring someone else. The Luminex central tower stretched so high that from its base, the sky looked like a sheet of glass tinted by power. Inside the grand lobby, everything operated as smoothly as debugged code. Receptionists wore synced earpieces. The carpets never bore a single hair, and the elevators were split into Zone A for regular staff and Zone B for senior management. There was only one elevator exclusively reserved for the executive chairman. Ethan Blake had never had to wait for an elevator. But that morning, due to a technical fault in the VIP shaft, he was forced to use the public elevator, the very one whose maintenance budget he had cut the previous year. Jonah had no reason to be in this building. Except for one thing. The doorman, Malik, had once worked security back when Jonah was still a mid-level manager. Malik still remembered him. When he saw Jonah standing under the awning in the cold rain, he glanced around and then unlocked the door with a backup guard card. "Just head up to the 3rd floor," Malik whispered. "There's a shared lounge. No one checks." Jonah nodded. He stepped into the empty elevator, but just as the doors were closing, a hand slipped between the stainless steel panels. Ethan Blake entered without looking up, headphones in, eyes fixed on his phone. Jonah turned slightly to avoid being noticed, but didn't step back. The doors closed. 2 men, 2 worlds, 2 histories, contained in a space wrapped in mirrored walls. The elevator began to rise. 5th floor, 9th floor, 13th floor. The soft ping of each level was the only sound, aside from the hum of precision mechanics, until 17th floor, thud. The elevator jolted to a stop. Lights flickered. The control panel blinked. A faint buzz from the intercom, then silence. Ethan looked up from his screen. He pulled out his headphones and started jabbing the control buttons. No response. Jonah stood still, hands resting on his violin case like a doorman waiting. Not afraid, not confused. Only his eyes remained unchanged. The only thing in the elevator is not affected by power loss. "This is strange," Ethan said dryly. "I thought I paid enough for things like this not to happen." "The thing you paid for," Jonah replied softly, "was to never have to share an elevator with someone like me." Ethan turned. Their eyes met. No more headphones, no more operating systems, no more safety protocols, just 2 men, and the parts of their pasts buried beneath the success stories. "You're Jonah Beckett," Ethan said quietly. Jonah nodded. Ethan didn't seem surprised. There was only a quiet recognition, as if he had just reopened an old file in his mind, one he had deleted but never emptied from the trash. "I thought you were dead," Ethan said. "So did I," Jonah replied. "But it turns out dying isn't the worst thing. Being forgotten while still alive is worse." Ethan looked down, silent. But that silence no longer held its usual authority. This time, it fit like a suit too tight. "I'm sorry for," Ethan began. "Sorry for what?" Jonah cut in. "For not calling when I disappeared from the system? Or for not realizing the system itself was designed, by you, to erase people like me? There was a crisis back then. We lost major contracts. I couldn't care about one person." Jonah said gently. Ethan said nothing. I'm not asking for my job back, Jonah continued. I don't need an office with glass walls or a leather chair. I just want one thing. Don't ever say, I chose this life. Ethan inhaled, as if the air inside the lift had grown too heavy to breathe normally. Jonah turned away, no longer looking at him. I don't expect you to understand. But if one day you wake up and your daughter looks at you like a stranger, maybe then you'll understand what I've lost. The elevator vibrated lightly. Ding. The doors opened. No announcement. They stepped out. No goodbye. No turning back. But left behind, in the mirrored walls of that elevator, was the reflection of two men who had once kept time for an entire world, and were now the ones time had quietly left behind. The grand ballroom of the Roosevelt Hotel shimmered under a ceiling of artificial stars, a vast lighting grid casting soft glows across every corner. Each table was draped in white linen, champagne flutes spaced exactly 8 centimeters apart per the branding team's guidelines. The annual Luminex Gala had become more than a celebration of employees. It was the moment Ethan Blake would unveil a new social initiative, as advised by his PR consultants. Down below the stage, Lila wore a dark velvet dress. In her hands was a small violin, the kind children use when just learning to play. She wasn't performing. She had simply brought it. On stage, Ethan stepped up. Every camera turned to him. His speech had been written, edited 17 times, and reviewed by 2 media strategists and 1 political scriptwriter. Every word had been calculated. Ethan stood before the mic, but when he saw someone seated in the last row, a man in a clean but old suit, no logos, no name tag, just a violin resting on his lap, he stopped. He removed the mic from its stand, didn't look at the cameras, only at the man in the back row. I won't be reading my speech tonight. A ripple of murmurs stirred across the room, then faded when Ethan raised his hand. Instead, I'd like to invite someone on stage, a man who once wrote the startup sound of Luminax, who taught me something I used to believe only money could buy. All eyes turned to the man rising from his seat and walking toward the stage. Jonah Beckett. He said nothing. He simply picked up his violin, rested it on his shoulder, and began to play. No introduction, no title, no soundtrack, only violin. At first, the notes were low, solitary, as if he were conversing with the instrument itself. Then the melody took form, something familiar. A tune once used in a corporate advertisement, but now slower, sadder, more honest. And at the crescendo, something in the room cracked, not from crying, not applause, but a silence so complete only truth could summon it. When the piece ended, Jonah bowed. No, thank you, no message. Ethan stepped forward and said exactly 7 words. We forgot a part of our soul. At big galas, the most moving moments rarely come from the stage, but from behind the spotlight, where someone is allowed to return after being deemed no longer of value. If you've ever been pushed aside and then returned in a way no one saw coming, you can share it in the comments. Not to be celebrated, but to let someone out there know it can happen. 9 months after the gala, a long-abandoned warehouse by the Chicago River, once a 1970s freight depot, was now covered by a massive mural. A child blowing a trumpet, surrounded by lines of painted sound waves that twisted like a heartbeat. A wooden sign hung out front, freshly painted. Project Second Strings, where forgotten hands remember how to play no ribbon-cutting ceremony. No CNN cameras. Just Lila, holding a pair of children's scissors, hands trembling as she snipped the blue ribbon and pushed open the wooden door. Inside was a vast, high-ceiling space. No air conditioning, but filled with light, sunlight pouring through dusty glass windows. Old chairs were arranged in a circle. On each one sat an instrument: violins, cellos, flutes, harmonicas, accordions. Most were donated by people who no longer played, but couldn't bear to throw them away. Jonah stood in the center of the circle. In his hands, a stringless violin, meant for the first child who would learn today, not by discipline, but by memory. Ethan entered last. He carried nothing but a folder of documents: a 3-year budget plan, a long-term lease contract, legal support documentation, and a handwritten promise. I will not interfere with any creative decisions. No one read it aloud, no speeches. Everyone looked at Jonah, then took their seats. A boy in a hoodie with torn shoulders was invited to the center chair. "What's your name?" Jonah asked. "Oh, Ricky." "Ever played an instrument before?" "Number. But I remember you playing at the train station. I liked that sound." Jonah nodded. He gently placed the violin into Ricky's hands. "Then today, we're not playing to be good. We're playing to learn how to listen to ourselves." 3 months later, second strings had spread to 3 more neighborhoods in the city. None of the locations taught music like traditional classrooms. No report cards, no printed syllabi, no one stood at a podium. Every session began with a single question: "This week, what made you stay silent?" Ethan Blake stepped down as CEO shortly after Luminax hit $20 billion in revenue. No farewell party, no press coverage. One autumn day, he showed up at Second Strings with a worn cardboard box. Inside was a bulky old laptop labeled Legacy Ethan OSV 0.13 Sound Module. The first file, Startup Beckett v1.aif. He handed it to Jonah. "I think this belongs here," he said. Jonah nodded. I didn't say thank you. But he opened the laptop and played the file. In the first few seconds, the entire room fell silent, as if every sound had stepped aside to make room for something deeper: memory. When the sound ended, Ricky, now holding his violin with confidence, looked up and asked, "What was that?" Ethan answered, "That was the sound of something they once said was impossible. Some pieces don't need a stage, projects that don't need $1 million investments, and lives that don't need to climb back up to prove anything. They just need someone not to leave them behind again." If you know someone like that, you can share their story in the comments. Not to retell, but to keep that memory alive a little longer in a world that's forgetting too fast. 1 year later, at a leadership and empathy seminar at a top business school, Ethan Blake walked on stage without slides. He wore a simple sweater, khakis, and no name tag. The first leader I ever learned from wasn't a founder, not a CEO, not a professor. It was a man the world once said had no more value. He paused. Eyes scanned across the rows of students. He didn't teach me how to lead. He taught me how to step back. And in doing so, he showed me everything I'd lost on the way up. No one clapped. They didn't know what to do. And that was the most honest moment of the entire event. Across the city, Jonah stepped out of a community music class with 2 twin children. In his hands was a new composition, untitled. But if you listened closely, at the 2:19 mark, you'd hear a section that mirrored the melody he once played in the elevator the day he got stuck with Ethan. Only this time, it had a harmony line. Written by Ricky. True innovation doesn't come from code or capital. It comes when we choose to listen, truly listen, to the forgotten.